Hello, welcome back. Today we're going to start talking about the axial skeleton. So your axial skeleton is your axis, right? So everything down the middle. So we're going to talk about our vertebrae, our ribs, and our sternum. So this will sort of put a period on the first section of the course. So the first section of the course is the skull and the axial skeleton. Pardon me. Moving forward, we'll go into the appendicular skeleton, which is your appendages. So today, the first bone that we're going to start with is the hyoid bone. So for those of you who are taking this course as part of a criminal justice major, the hyoid bone comes into play a lot in autopsies and things like that when we're talking about cause of death. The hyoid bone is here in the throat. It's sort of a floating bone. It's right here in the throat. And if anybody has any trauma to their throat from a strangulation, this bone will be indicative of that trauma. So when things happen to this bone, we can assume that there was some sort of trauma to the neck. So the hyoid bone. So it's just a little bone, like I said, and it sort of floats here in the throat area. So that's like your Adam's apple when you swallow. So there's not a lot to this bone. In your book, if we're following along, we're in chapter 9, and this would be it starts on page 155, but you're going to see photos on page 156. Okay, so there's just a few landmarks. You guys will have a term sheet, so make sure you're looking. Oh, I'm going to point. Yep, that's the right way. Nope, this is the right way. I'm going to point this way. It's going to be in your extra materials here on the side. So, the hyoid. So there's only really 3 parts of this bone. So when you're looking at it, okay, you have this main part in the middle. Okay, so this would be where your Adam's apple is. That is the body. Okay, so that's the body of this bone. And it has 2 horns. So if you're looking at this bone, these very big ones here that sort of go on either side of your throat, those are your greater horns. Okay, so your body and then your greater horns, and then these 2 little ones that stick up. Okay, those are going to be your lesser horns. Okay, so not a whole lot to this bone, and it's a very fragile little bone in your body, so you can understand why, if there's any trauma to the neck or the throat, this bone would be representative of that trauma. Okay, so next we're going to jump into our vertebrae, and that's just right on your next page in your book, 157. It does start with just some general vertebrae. So why don't we, I'm thinking what's the easiest thing to do. Yeah, let's go ahead and jump into some of the things that are going to be on every single bone. So on your term sheet, you'll see it laid out as cervical vertebrae. And then you've got your atlas and your axis, which are your first 2 vertebrae in your neck. They're different. They're outliers. So let's go ahead and set those aside for now. And we'll circle back to those 2 because it's important to know that those 2 are different. But let's talk about our cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae as a whole, because they're all going to share these landmarks that you see kind of listed, bullet pointed under lumbar vertebrae. So you're going to see those on every single vertebrae except for those first 2. And the difference between your cervical, so your cervical vertebrae are the vertebrae of your neck, okay? Your thoracic are the vertebrae here in the middle where your ribs are attached, and then your lumbar is your lower back area, okay? So all of your vertebrae are going to have a few things in common. I'm just going to grab a lumbar because they're nice and big and chunky so we can see everything really, really easily. Okay, so the first thing you're going to see on your term sheet is the vertebral body. So this big round area right here, that's your vertebral body, okay? So that's what is sort of on the anterior portion, okay? So this is what's facing in on your body, okay? So you've got these vertebral body. In between each of those vertebral bodies are your discs. So if anybody, you've ever heard somebody say, oh, I slipped a disc, a lumbar, a thoracic, a cervical disc, that happens in between. So in between each one of these vertebrae, okay, so I'm just going to sandwich two of these guys together. Hold on. Whoop. I'm upside down, that's why. I'm going to sandwich two of these guys together. Okay, so you can see that wouldn't feel great if these two bones were rubbing up against each other. So in between those bodies, you have thick, cushiony discs, okay? So that helps our spines take the impact of all of the motion that we do every day. So again, if you see trauma to that, it can tell you something about that individual's body. If the discs have ruptured or slipped, you might see in the skeleton, in the remains, evidence of those discs rubbing together. That could tell you a couple different things depending on when that trauma happened. So this could be an older person, and that's just a product of degeneration. It could be somebody who's had a traumatic injury at some point in their life. It could be somebody who's an athlete. Again, those will tell you things. So if you know, again, this is going to criminal investigation. If you know something about your victim and you find remains, if you know that they had had a spinal surgery for a slip disc or something like that, those are things that you could look at in the remains to see if that matches up. Okay, so that's the body. The body is going to be this big circular area right here on all of the bones. Let's see, what do we have next? The vertebral foramen. So I'm just going to hold that up. That should be pretty obvious to you guys. What's a foramen? A foramen's a hole. So we've got our vertebral foramen. What do we think goes through there? That's going to be our spinal cord, right? So our spinal cord is going to go through this vertebral foramen, okay? So your vertebra protect and encase your spinal column, which is your bundle of nerves that's going to go for all the way from your lower body up to your brain so that you can send signals for motion. So we have two articular facets. We have a superior and an inferior articular facet. So let's talk about what that term means. Let's break that down. So an articular facet is an area where two bones articulate or come together. So we've talked about condyles, right? We had our occipital condyles, we had our mandibular condyles. Those are joints that are very flexible and tend to move, right? We can rotate or move in a lot of ways the action of that joint. With our spines, we don't have as much articulation, right? So those articular facets are going to be a little bit different. They're not going to be rounded condyles. So if you can see here in the front, I'm kind of see where these two bones are coming together. Those are our articular facets. So on this bone, right, this is the superior side of the bone. So this is the superior articular facet, which would be the same as this one up here, right? I'm pointing it to it here and here, okay? Here and here. Now, where it connects on the bottom, this is the inferior articular facet. So that would be here, here, and here. So see how those come together, okay? So this bone here is connecting on the inferior facet, and this one's connecting on the superior. So when your inferior and superior come together, that's how that articulates, okay? Do you guys see that? All right. Boop, boop, boop. What is our transverse process? Okay, so transverse, okay? So remember a transverse plane, right? It's going to divide the body this way. So these are our transverse process, right? They're two processes that stick out laterally, right? They go, this is your body. These are going to move left and right. Actually, that one's upside down. I'm going to do it that way. Left and right, okay? So these process stick out to the sides. And then your spinous process is this guy right here, okay? And that's called the spinous process because if you were to touch your back, that's what you're feeling. You're feeling all of those individual spinous process of each one of these bones, okay? So the transverse go laterally out, right? And this is anterior, okay? So if you're looking at this bone, or sorry, this is posterior. Anterior towards the front is the body. Posterior towards the back is the spinous process. And then laterally, we have our transverse process. We have our superior articular facet and our inferior articular facet. Okay? So with this little lumbar vertebrae, right, I think that looks like a little animal head to me. It looks kind of like, let's see, maybe a giraffe, if you guys can see it. Okay, so these ears, right, are the transverse process. The superior articular facet are the little horns. They have those little nubby horns, right? These here are inferior facets, are like his cheeks, and the spinous process is his nose. That's what I think of when I think of the spine. So those are going to be on every single vertebrae, okay? You guys don't necessarily need to know this. Here is a thoracic. See, he looks even more like a little giraffe to me. But on a thoracic, see, you're going to see this. He's just not as robust as the lumbar, right? His body is a little smaller. His spinous process is a little bit longer. His nose is a little bit longer. So we still have the same things. We have those transverse process, the spinous process, the body in the back, the superior and inferior facets. And then on the sides, let's see if I can find a good one. They're not as easy to see because this isn't a real, it's a cast, so it's plastic. But you would have notches here on the sides. It would be a little bit more obvious if you had like a natural skeleton, but that's where your ribs would attach, right? Because they come out of the back and they move forward. So this here is a thoracic vertebrae. So you can see it's a little bit different in shape. And let me find a good cervical. Okay. So this is a cervical, right? Even smaller, right? This body is less rounded. It's kind of more oval, right? And you can just see in general, they're a little bit less robust. So your lumbar are going to be really big and robust. Your thoracics are going to be a little bit smaller. And then again, even your cervical are going to be more petite, if you will. Okay, so I do have transverse. I got all of those. I'm going to take a look at the first two, your atlas and your axis. So let me find the page of those in your book. Okay. Do they have them labeled. All right, so we don't really have directions labeling them, but if you go to page 166, you'll see at the top C1 and C2, okay? So the C stands for cervical 1 and cervical 2. Those are your first two vertebrae. And they're labeled superior, inferior. So if you had somebody say like, oh, this is T4, vertebrae T4, that means it's thoracic vertebrae number 4. Just in case you guys ever, if again, you go into the field of investigation, you ever see that on a report, the vertebrae are going to be numbered by their location. So C for cervical, T for thoracic, L for lumbar. And then they're going to be numbered starting from the top, superior, to the inferior. Okay, so we're going to look at the first two cervical vertebrae by themselves because they are unique. They don't have the same characteristics as the other vertebrae. So C1, okay? C1 is called our atlas. So if you guys know anything about mythology, Greek mythology, Atlas holds up the world, right? So there's a great statue in Rockefeller Center of Atlas, right? He's on one knee and he's shouldering the world, okay? The globe, the earth on his back. So we refer to C1 as the atlas because it shoulders the skull. So we found those occipital condyles. So you'll see these kind of flattened areas here. Oops, I'm going to hold that up a little bit higher. These flattened areas here. This is where those occipital condyles sit into. They kind of nest in there very nicely, okay? Okay, so you've got these condyles here on either side. And then you can see in the cervical vertebrae, I don't have it on your list, but these also, you know it's a cervical because right as part of your transverse process, they also have a foramen, a transverse foramen. For identification purposes, that's really helpful. That's where some extra nerves come from that go down into your arms. So you can see that this first vertebrae looks very different from all of the other vertebrae. Okay, so you've got those areas here that hold your occipital condyles, and then you've got those little foramen. Then you've got C2, which we call the axis. Okay, so it's a very weird little bone. Okay, so again, it's going to look different from all of our other cervical vertebrae because it's got this strange protrusion that sticks straight up. Okay, so this is the superior side. And what that does, where is our, there we go. I'm just going to articulate these two together. Okay, so that allows this motion of the neck. Okay. So you can see, so we've got this process that sticks straight up on C2. And when we nestle C1 in there, we can rotate. Just trying to figure out the best angles for you guys. Okay? So this little protrusion, this process that sticks straight up on C2, or our axis, right? Because we can turn on an axis. Called the dens. Okay, so it's got its own name. That's called the dens, and you should see that on your term sheet. Okay, so those are all of the vertebrae. Let's jump into the sternum. So we're just going to skip over to chapter 10, which is your sternum and your ribs. So your sternum is going to start, photos that are going to start on page 182 in your book. Okay, so here is our sternum. Okay, so this is obviously a cast of the sternum, but it would sit right here. So this here is the top of your sternum. Okay, So the sternum is made up of two separate bones. So you've got this bone on the top, and you can see there's a slight, this is a cast. So some of the bones I have actual human bones. So landmarks are much easier to see. Some of them I have casts, which they're just plastic. Landmarks are a little bit harder to see on the plastic ones, but you can see that there is a suture there. Okay, so this top part is your manubrium. This part here is the corpus sterni. So your manubrium, corpus sterni, we know corpus, corpse or body, sternum, sterni. So it's the body of the sternum, corpus sterni, and your manubrium. Let's see, the xiphoid process. Do we have that in your book? We don't have that pointed to in your book, but there's also oftentimes, oh, see this, they're making this one really obvious. This is a small little bone. So it's also separated by some cartilage. This is your xiphoid process. So if some of you guys, I know some people have sort of more of a concave, and they can feel that sort of xiphoid process poking out the bottom. So that would be right here at the bottom. Your jugular notch. So if we're looking at the superior side, there's a little indentation here. It's not really great on this cast, but your book does a beautiful job of demonstrating it. There's a notch. So actually, if you were to stick your finger right here at the bottom of your throat, that's what you're feeling. You're feeling that jugular notch. Okay? So that is why chokeholds can be so dangerous, because your jugular actually comes so close to the top. And if you put pressure here, it doesn't take a lot of pressure between your jugular and your bone here, your sternum, to cut off that blood flow. So that can be really, really, really dangerous, as we know. So chokeholds are not a great idea. There's kind of no way to guarantee that you're doing one safely. That's your jugular notch. Clavicular notch. So you can see here, this is a representation of cartilage. This cartilage would be to your clavicle. So on either side, you see these notches here. We have a clavicular notch. First costal notch. That's going to be, so this cast doesn't do a great job of differentiating between a lot of these notches. So here at the top is your clavicular. Your book does a beautiful job. And then here, kind of just below it, is your first costal. So for some reason, we call ribs costals. Don't ask me why. That one I don't know. Maybe I should look it up. If you guys know that, put it in the comments. So you've got a clavicular notch because your clavicle, right, is coming in and attaching here. And then your first rib just below it is also attaching. So you have a clavicular notch, which makes sense because your clavicle is attaching. And then you have your first costal notch. So remember, costal equals rib. And then all the way down, you have costal notches, right? Because these are the areas where all of our ribs attach. So first costal notch is for your first rib, and then the rest of them are just referred to as costal notches. So costal equals rib. All right. Finally, to button up this section, we're going to talk about ribs. So this is rib. We're just going to say rib in general. We're not going to worry about identifying where on the body this rib is. The only one that gets some special attention is this first rib, right? This is a little bit weird, right? So we always look at the weird ones. So the first rib, if you look at it in comparison, so it's kind of flat, right? This one's got some height to it. The first rib is really flat and really small. So this area here is where it attaches to the spine. Okay, so this is the head of the rib. Okay, so this area here, it attaches to the spine. It's the head of the rib. Just behind the head is the neck. Okay, let me just find this page. Special ribs. Are they going to show me anything special about that one? They have a picture. Ah, yes. So they've got page 190 shows your first rib. So head, neck. This is going to be the shaft, right? The main area. On the underside, you're going to see there's not a whole lot going on the underside. On the superior side, we've got some grooves. Do I have them listed in your term sheet? No. Okay. That's okay. We don't need to know all of those landmarks. So head, neck, right? We've got the shaft, okay? So in this, if we were to side this, we would look and see that one side is pretty smooth, okay? The other side is pretty bumpy. So if we're looking at our book, we can see that the superior side of this bone has a lot going on, and that the inferior side is pretty smooth. So I would be able to say, for me, if I take the head of this and I move it to the back, this would be, and I know it's reversed for you guys, okay, but this is a right. So your first rib is a little bit different, okay? So it's not going to look like the rest of the ribs. So if you were to find this, okay, just so that you would be able to identify it. Okay, and this very blunt end here is where it attaches to the manubrium. Okay, so let's look at our ribs in general. So we still have a head, right, and a neck. Okay, and then we've got our tubercle right here. So this is this little tubercle here. So this is all attaching to the back of the body. So if I were to wear this rib, I would put it this way, right? So the head, actually it's on this side. Whoop. So the head attaches to the spine, okay, to your thoracic vertebrae. Right behind the head is this little smaller area that's the neck. And then we've got a tubercle, okay, that protrusion right there. So head, neck, tubercle are all going to be posterior. Head, neck, tubercle, posterior. What other landmarks do we have? We have the angle, okay? So if we're looking at this, this here is the angle, right? It's the area at which it starts to turn to come forward or anterior, okay? Maybe if I stand up a little bit. I'm sorry, it's very bright. Let me see if I can move over a little bit. So, okay, so if I was to wear this rib, right, it'd be just like this. I don't know if that helps or not. So, we've got the head, the neck, the tubercle, where it starts to turn to move anterior or forward is your angle. Shaft is going to be the main area, okay? This is all the shaft. So we have a cranial edge and a caudal edge. Cranial edge is going to be superior because it's towards your cranium, okay? So then the caudal edge is going to be inferior. So if we're looking at this bone, and it does a pretty good job in the book of showing you this, our cranial edge is very rounded, okay? So if you guys were to find a rib, to be able to figure out where it goes, your cranial edge is going to be more rounded, and that's going to face up. Your caudal edge, see that angle? It's pretty sharp, okay? So even if you guys get some barbecue, some ribs, you should be able to see this in your bones, okay? So your caudal edge or your inferior edge is going to be almost like a sharp angle, or yeah, it's going to be very sort of angular and sharp. And your book does show that. Okay, so your costal groove, again, costal equals rib. So maybe even just put that on your term sheet or write that down somewhere. Costal equals rib. So anytime you hear the word costal, it's rib. Costal groove. So if we're looking at that inferior where the angle is, okay, just on the inside, there is a groove here, okay? That is your costal groove, okay? If you guys hear that sound, my dog is, I don't know, making noises. Sorry. So, hey, hey. She's trying to get cozy. So yes, that's your costal groove. Okay, so you should be able to also see that in your book. So that's how we orient the rib. So the head goes posterior. The cranial edge is going to be rounded. The inferior edge is going to be sharp. Okay, and that costal groove, what that does is there's muscles in between all of your ribs. So when you're eating rib meat, that's what you're eating. There's muscles in between each rib that helps us inflate and deflate our chest when we breathe. And then your final landmark is going to be your sterna end. So sternum, sterna. Okay, so it's this very sort of blunt end is going to be the most anterior because it attaches to your sternum. All right, that is everything. We're about 30 minutes into this lecture, so hopefully you guys were able to digest all of that. Take a look. I gotta remember that everything I do on the video is backwards. Take a look on the side here, and you will see in your materials, there should be a term sheet for this. There will be. And I'm also going to try to pop it into the module too. But if you guys ever can't find something, go into that sidebar and look for the in the materials or the in that folder, and everything for the course will be in there. If you guys have any questions, you know, to email me. And also check out the discussion questions for this. You guys don't need to just use the discussion for the pre-formed discussion questions. If you guys have other things that you want to ask your classmates about, certainly go ahead and jump in there and do that. All right, have a great day.